Can you think like a designer? Welcome to the Creativity Cure podcast. I'm your host, Bethany Joy, and I am the owner of Bethany J Photography as well as a visual designer. On this podcast, I share how the skills I've learned as a designer and artist can be used to improve your life every single day. I am here to build your confidence. I believe everybody has something to offer, and I believe everybody can be creative. You just need the skills. The goal that I had with this podcast was to make design more accessible. I use design every single day in every single area of my life. Of course, it started with art, it started with graphic design, but I've used it to address other areas of my life. I'm starting a new series where we're going to discuss something called design thinking. Design thinking is a process designers use to solve problems rapidly. It's a method that designers use to create products very quickly, and it involves 5 steps. Empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. Designers use these tools and these steps to quickly create products that they test. So, to begin our series talking about how being creative can apply to daily life, we're going to start by talking about empathy. And on this podcast, I'm going to be specifically talking about self-compassion, empathy for yourself. Empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. It's not about agreeing or pitying someone. Empathy ultimately is about understanding the context of why and how someone else thinks. When we turn this practice of empathizing inward, I call it self-compassion. Practicing self-compassion is about understanding the context of who you are as a person and being kind to yourself. Essentially, you treat yourself the way you would treat a good friend, showing understanding and kindness and sympathy. So, I used self-compassion myself to overcome mental roadblocks and to create a growth mindset. I've talked about this before. I believe that the ability to come back from failure and the ability to not be afraid of risk is key to being creative, and it's key to putting yourself out there. So let's talk about empathy and why it should start with being kind to yourself. So how do designers use empathy? Well, and by the way, I am reading notes here because I've got a lot of good information. So before you try and solve a problem as a designer, if you want it to be successful, you need to ensure that you create something that people actually want to use rather than something that you like. And that means that you want to avoid bias, right? Bias can be from your age, your gender. It could also be from your cultural background. It can even come from your abilities. Often when we approach a problem, our first thought is to solve it or think of it and how it relates to us. But empathy is a practice of going out of your way, taking your time to actually understand someone else's motivations, feelings, and needs thoroughly before you create something for them. This practice of empathy is what is at the beginning of product design, or good product design, I should say. A good product really understands the problem it's solving. If you want it to be successful, you really need to do that. And the best way you can understand the problem you're solving is by listening and asking questions. A designer has to put themselves in their user's shoe in order to create something that can really help them. So how can we take this idea of empathy, the way designers use it, and apply it to our everyday lives? Well, I want to talk about that today. It's easier said than done because we do all have our own ideas of what empathy means. We all have our own limits, our own context, so to speak, of what we think is acceptable. So we really do have a need to learn how to empathize with each other. We want to appreciate each other's originality, and we want to create better relationships without sacrificing our integrity. And empathy can allow you to do that. So to prepare for this series that I am starting, I actually read a book called Never Split the Difference, which is a really great book. I think I mentioned it in my last podcast, but it actually talks about negotiation, which actually starts with empathy. Now, the book explains how you use empathy in your communication to get what you need while also understanding someone else's perspective. It encourages you to actually invite the other person to exercise their creativity to come up with a solution that works for both of you. I also really like that this book focuses on challenging the problem and not the person. It's about solving the problem and not attacking the person. And I think that's a really good tool to have in your back pocket, that whenever conflict arises, whenever you're struggling, whenever you need to use empathy, it's not about the person as much as it is the problem. And in that way, we don't get stuck on trying to change people, which we really cannot do. We focus on coming up with collaborative solutions instead. So Chris Voss starts the book, and he talks about how it's universal that all human beings want to be desired and understood and accepted. We all want to be heard. However, I'm going to add a little bit to this and say that in order to offer compassion or empathy to others, I think you really do need to have compassion and empathy for yourself. Which I guess, since empathy is about others, we're going to just keep saying self-compassion. For me, I am a Christian, so empathy for me really does start with what theology calls the Imago Dei concept. So here's a quote from Christianity Today, and it defines what the Imago Dei is. So humans are created in the image of God, and this is to acknowledge the special qualities of human nature that allow God to be manifest in us. Having a conscious recognition that humans are made in God's image means that they are able to make God's plans and purposes known and actualized. And this way, humans are co-creators with God. The Imago Dei doctrine has moral implications because if humans love God, then they must also love each other, since we are all expressions of God. And honoring each other then becomes the best way to honor God. So I believe that each human is original, and that includes you, and that includes me. And when you accept the good and bad and ugly about yourself, you honor the fact that you're human. You're not perfect, but you still need compassion and care. God sees us in all of our mess-ups, and he chooses us anyway. And I believe that we can see our own faults and understand that we need compassion. We need grace. And by that, I just mean that we cannot walk through life expecting to never get it wrong. Now, I'm going to take a quick detour before we get too deep in this, and I want to talk to you about compassion. Speaking of it, when was the last time you celebrated your achievements? I mean, really. I know for me, it's been a very long time. I am so used to working and struggling towards my goals, focusing, that many times I tell myself, I'll just wait, I'll wait until the time comes and I'm able to celebrate. I'll wait for the vacation. But you know what? Life goes by really fast. And before you know it, you've missed out on stopping and reflecting on those important big moments in your life. I don't want this to be you. And that's why I want to invite you to have a photography experience with me, Bethany J Photography. That's my company. And it is a one-of-a-kind experience. I create fine art portraits that are original and crafted around you, based on you. There's nobody like you, and your photos should prove it. I make custom sets, including hair, makeup, and styling. And I just want to say this. I just had my portraits taken with one of my great photo friends, Nina, and the experience was amazing for me. I really hadn't taken a moment to just get some nice pictures of myself, and it had been so long, and it really was such an encouragement for me to continue to be creative and to put myself out there. And it just started with that simple act of taking the time to go and get pictures done and celebrate how far I've come as an artist. So I want to invite you to do the same. It's really more than just photography for me, This is something I do, and I really believe it is an art form, because the images I create of you are a collaborative effort. And I think that everybody really should get professional photography in their lifetime. It's even better if you can get a custom fine art portrait. So if you're interested, please visit BethanyJphotography.com. And if you're not ready to get a portrait done, I'd still like to be connected to you. So I invite you to join my community by visiting BethanyJphotography.com. You can check out my free newsletter where I celebrate women every single week who are doing amazing things here in Maryland. They are everyday people who decide to put themselves out there to use their creativity to persevere. And I call this newsletter Seen and Celebrated. I want you to be seen and celebrated. Those who join the newsletter can see all of the previous letters that I sent out with all of the stories of each person who I feature. And you can also submit your own story, as well as submit even an idea to be on the podcast. So I invite you to visit it. And if you have questions, feel free to email me. My email information is all in the description. All right, so back to compassion. Why do we struggle with having compassion for ourselves? I know that, at least among some women, and I think this is just a normal thing. I think that there's this thing we do where someone compliments us and we put ourselves down, They say, you look really nice, and, you then immediately point out some other flaw you have, kind of like a deflection. And I do think that this comes from a really good place of not wanting to be self-centered and wanting to be humble. And I do think that there is a way you can be so self-focused that you just completely miss people around you. That I don't think is healthy. But compassion to me isn't about putting others down and lifting yourself up. To me, compassion is taking responsibility for your emotions, for your body, for your spirit. It's about not letting what happened to you define you. You decide the path that you take. And I think compassion helps us to be responsible with how we take our actions in the world. So I think that many people believe that feelings don't matter. Your discomfort doesn't matter. So, and I think many people have been told that really at the end of the day, the results are the only thing that matters. And I think that for me, I believed that for a long time. I just believed, if you just push through, ignore yourself, you'll get through it. You'll have your break eventually, but don't worry about yourself. Just keep going. I believed, just do what you're supposed to do. It'll all be okay. And for a long time, I was able to accomplish a lot, but I paid a price for it. Because the way that I was motivating myself was not healthy, and it involved really just turning off the alarms. I think we talked about this last time. Turning off the alarms in my head. Your emotions are an alarm. They just signal that something needs to be attended to. And if you just ignore all of them because they're inconvenient, 9 times out of 10, it's going to come out somewhere. So compassion, I believe, actually frees you up to persevere through hard times and to challenge yourself. And I think it's because you give yourself more room for error. Now, I had an example here where, let's say you want to try something new, okay? Let's say dancing, right? Like, say you want to be a dancer, and so you start taking classes. Well, if your inner dialogue, whenever you mess up in the class, is to call yourself stupid or be like, come on, you can get this, like, you just, like, what's wrong with you? If it's just constant criticism, putting yourself down, you may just start to avoid dancing, right? You may just start to avoid things that challenge you. And this is like a silly analogy, but I think it's true that we fail at one thing because we expect perfection, and then we set the standard that we can't try anything we won't be perfect at. And that is the opposite of what you want if you want a growth mindset. You want to be okay with failure. You want to be okay with sometimes embarrassing yourself. Because the truth is you cannot learn unless you have the freedom of failing. However, if you approach that same dance class expecting to fail, but instead of discouraging yourself, stopping when you mess up, looking at what you've done wrong, asking for help, I think that dance class won't be a symbol of your failure. It'll just be a place where you're learning to grow and experiment and express yourself. And maybe you'll be able to carry that attitude into your job, which might open a door to something better in the future. Because you become somebody who's okay with mistakes, somebody who's okay with trying again and again, someone who understands that they don't have to be right all of the time. Someone who's okay with hearing feedback and doesn't allow feedback of their technique to be feedback of who they are as a person. I think that having compassion for yourself makes you resilient. Being able to live through mistakes, hurts, and past failures, and to get up and to try again is somebody who's strong. It's somebody who can endure through the things that life will throw at you. Life's unpredictable. You're going to get something crazy happening to you. And being able to push through without bullying yourself is something that I think everybody should learn. So I have a question I want you to ask yourself. Do you see yourself as the start and end of progress? Do you constantly think about how you're going to suck it up because if you don't, you'll ruin it for everybody else? Do you withdraw alone when you struggle so you don't feel burdened or you don't feel like you are a burden? Do you feel as if you must appear happy or always agree to get people to like you? Viewing yourself as the problem can stem from the idea that we have to look a certain way to be accepted. If we aren't the way that people want us to be, this is the thought we may have. If we aren't the way people want us to be, we might lose friends, we might lose jobs, and people may not like us. And sometimes that idea is scarier than being truthful with ourselves. The truth is, life is full of unknowns, and holding yourself to a really high standard isn't realistic. And it actually ends up being self-sabotage, because if you continually believe that you are the problem, you may start acting as if you are, which probably is not true. So instead of sucking it up, I encourage honesty, and I think it's okay to do what you need to do and be honest about not liking it. So I guess what I'm saying is that self-compassion isn't about not being strong or not pushing for your goals or dreams because it's difficult. I think it's about being honest about how you feel about the challenges you face. Knowing that it's okay to not feel brave when you're going to go and do something new. I want to talk about why self-compassion is important, and it has to do with something called the frequency illusion. And the frequency illusion is a psychological phenomenon that means we become hyper aware of something we think is important. And so I don't know if you've ever saw a car one day that caught your eye and then suddenly you see it everywhere. That's the frequency illusion. And what happens is when we hyper focus on our failures, we start to notice them way more than we do anything else we do right, And I think everybody can relate to one time you mess up sticks in your memory far more than all of the things you might have gotten right. And it's easy to understand because we like to avoid pain. And so we want to avoid painful memories and painful scenarios. However, when we focus on surviving, right? So focus on avoiding pain or fearful situations, our brains are not free to be at ease, to relax, to think of solutions. And the truth is, when we're going to face unknown challenges or difficult things, we actually want to be relaxed and at ease and able to attack those problems with our best brains and not our fearful survival brains. So when you're worried about safety, right, it's hard to be creative. When we're in this state of survival, it's hard to make decisions. It's hard to be who all we want to be when we're constantly anxious. In fact, for me, when I was anxious or when I deal with anxiety, it makes my world smaller. Whenever I give in and I run away from what's scaring me instead of confronting the actual anxiety and overcoming what is giving me that fear or problem. What this comes down to is that when you focus on yourself as the problem, when you talk down to yourself and bully yourself, you're creating an environment of survival, because getting things right isn't just about successfully completing a task. It becomes about proving your self-worth. But if you have compassion for yourself and you understand that you're a human being, then you're free to make mistakes. You're free to make choices, better ones the next time, because you don't have to live up to this impossible standard that you've probably set up for yourself or even had someone put on you. Now, the reality is some people struggle with self-compassion because they haven't seen it modeled. And if you haven't experienced compassion or seen it modeled, it's very difficult to unlearn the habit of talking down to yourself. It's not uncommon for us to learn our self-talk from how we saw other adults or parents speak to themselves. Many times we may forget that the way we speak to ourselves, the way we think about ourselves comes out through our speech, and little ones pick that up and they begin to model their self-speech to it. In fact, I've seen my daughter look in the mirror the same way I do, and that really showed me like, oh, she's watching everything I do, and that's going to become some of the way she understands the world around her, including herself. If you are around people who are extremely hard on themselves, and you find yourself being the same way, it's very good odds that that's where you picked it up from and have possibly enforced it. But the great thing is that our brains continue to grow. We're not stuck. And I just want you to hear that. You're not stuck. If you have a certain habit or pattern, you can get help. You can move past it. You can move forward. But you do have to do work to get there. And also, I just want to remind you that having self-compassion isn't just for you. The way you relate to yourself is the way that you'll relate to other people. So having compassion for yourself will help you to be compassionate and empathetic towards other people. Often just leave it there. And if you choose to work on having better self-compassion, the little ones around you, whether it's your kids, your nephews, your nieces, your students, they're going to pick up on it too. I know this for a fact because I see my daughter, when she hurts herself, I stop and I ask, are you okay? And I wait and I say, are you okay? And I watch her play with her baby doll, and she does the same thing. So she's watching and picking up, and she's only one. She's picking up, oh, let me see if the baby is okay. So yeah, if you start to work on you, it goes so far beyond you. It just starts with you. So I want to say it is really, really easy to think of the world in black and white. And if you struggled with being depressed or anxious, if you struggled with negativity, or you've had a lot of bad trauma or experiences in your life. Now, I'm not speaking as a therapist, so please take everything I say with a grain of salt. If you have struggled with negativity, with not thinking you're good enough, with these repeated thought patterns, it's really easy to continue to believe that because things have always been one way, they will always be that way. And the way our brains are, it's like the frequency illusion. You start to affirm that belief, and you don't want to do that. You want to break that habit. Our brains truly grow and change. So if you can't believe it for yourself, just believe the actual fact that our brains are very much able to change even as we get older. We're not stuck one way forever. The things that we choose not to address over time do hurt our bodies, our physical bodies. Continually talking down to yourself, continually putting yourself down, continually beating yourself up has a negative effect. It raises your cortisol levels, right? And if you want to live a long, healthy life, if you don't want to be stressed all the time, then you have to address the root of the problem. And maybe self-compassion is part of it. Maybe just hearing this talk today will motivate you to get help if you need it, or it'll motivate you to just notice how many times you actually do talk to yourself and work towards changing that inner dialogue and recognizing that there's a pattern and that there is help to get better.